This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, which I've declared to be the official 300th episode of Roots and All. Thanks to my ineptitude with numbers and the various podcast app numbering systems, I expect I am the only person who reckons this to be episode 300. But I've gone back through and I say it is, and that's final. So welcome. Welcome to the 300th episode. That's one in the eye for the doubters who thought back in 2018 that I was a rank amateur with no sticking power. And here I am in 2024, a rank amateur with an apparent bit of stamina about me when it comes to churning out podcasts. I'd like to start by saying a very big thank you to all the wonderful guests who've given so freely of their knowledge so that we can all become better gardeners and environmental stewards. And thank you to all of you who've downloaded an episode, pressed play, given the podcast a review, commented on social media or emailed me with thoughts and feedback. Without the guests and without you listeners, it would just be me chatting into a microphone, and this podcast would have disappeared a long time ago. But the guests are still willing to come on, more of you are listening all the time, and I'm still here. So between us, we've breathed life into this pretty amazing entity called Roots and All, and today is a celebration of that. In this episode, I'm going to take a look back at some of the top performing episodes, some of my favourite episodes and some of yours, and take a bit of time to reflect on the sheer enormity and, yeah, I'll say it, the sheer excellence of the back catalogue of the podcast. So, without further ado, I'd like to announce the top 3 episodes of all time, as ranked by the most downloads. In third place, we have Cottage Gardens with Andrew Sankey. In second place, we have No Dig with Charles Dowding. And in first place, it's Hugh Richards on veg growing. So congratulations to Hugh, Charles and Andrew. Not to detract from the episodes or the individuals, because they're all fantastic and real experts in their fields. But I wonder if the larger download numbers were because listeners from their huge audiences popped over to the podcast to listen to their heroes, which raises an interesting question off the bat. Should I be courting celebrity guests, or those with a large following, in order to piggyback onto their audiences and get more downloads? You'll probably be unsurprised to hear this is a common technique recommended in podcasting circles in order to grow your audience. And it's one I've considered and categorically rejected from the off for Roots and All. There might be a spin-off series where I chat with celebrities who grow prize-winning parsnips, but for Roots and All, it's always been about finding the most qualified and the most fascinating people who are doing the most interesting and innovative work. The criteria for selecting a guest is always, are they doing something interesting, unique, different, or particularly well? And if they have 8 books published, a TV series and 1 million followers on Instagram, that's great. And if it's just them tinkering with plants in their shed, that's great too. So, on to my favourite episode, which I couldn't possibly choose if you put a gun to my head. What I've done instead is thought about a few that are memorable or that stand out for various reasons, and I've chosen some that have been picked by you too. When I do the episode 500 retrospective, my favourites will have changed, as I am fickle and forgetful, and I change like the weather. But for now, let's start with the episode featuring Esiah Levy of the SeedsShare project, which was one of the earliest I recorded. Esiah, aka the Croydon Gardener, set up a project growing and harvesting heirloom open-pollinated seeds in an attempt to propagate lesser-known varieties and to encourage diversity in our vegetable crops. I had no idea what I was doing in terms of technology, and I was a nervous interviewer. Esiah recorded in the stairwell of his building to keep the background noise to a minimum. The episode is raw and rustic, and just what podcasting was about when it very first started as a medium. Not long after the episode was released, I learned Esiah had passed away, and although we only chatted briefly, I felt a real connection to the great work he was doing, and a desire to do my small part to keep it going, and to inspire others by sharing Esiah's knowledge.
Where corn originally came from, it wasn't just yellow. So everything that we're growing in the UK and everything that we're buying seeds for and everything that we're thinking is strictly uniform, strict rules, and we have to abide by that particular colour, shape, flavour, even name. Originally, it wasn't grown that way. It was grown with nature, not against nature. And colour, variety, creativity, that was at the forefront.
Yeah.
It was only when it was taken from those countries and brought back to the UK, another country like the UK, and it was then marketed, and then it was turned into a cash cow. And that's when it loses its soul. Because at the end of the day, growing food, like cooking food, like eating food, is about the soul.
A while after the episode was released, a relative of Esiah's commented they'd found the podcast, therefore his beautiful voice. And it struck me what an important medium audio is for capturing all these stories and voices. People often ask me what drives me to do the podcast, and I expect in part, and on a level that's been fairly subconscious until now, I felt a need to capture voices from across the spectrum of horticulture. And I also love people who break with convention, like Esiah. So here's where I hand over to a listener for a suggestion. And this was suggested by Lucinda Weldon, and it's episode 136, In Search of Mycotopia, with Doug Bierend. When Lucy suggested the mushroom guy, I asked which one. There are 3 episodes on mushrooms and 2 on mycorrhizal fungi in the back catalogue, which to me is indicative of 2 things. 1, I'm personally quite fascinated by fungi, and 2, there's still such an unknown quantity, and people are starting to really dig into and explore the mushroom kingdom.
As I was speaking to you, I realised that actually a lot of the questions that I had prepared for you kind of tended towards asking what mushrooms can do for us. But then as I listened to you speak, I thought, is there anything that we can do for mushrooms, or do they not need our help? Are they way beyond us in terms of evolution?
I love that question. Yeah, I mean, they don't need our help, I don't think. And it's hard to say because, like we alluded to before, we just don't even know what's out there as far as fungi. So we can't even really get a good sense of, what we're losing to habitat loss and climate change. And I noticed myself using the word we're losing, because, yeah, it's from a human perspective. And I tend to assess any question about like saving the world or preventing a climate catastrophe and all in terms like that. Like, we're always talking about whether it's going to help humans survive. Like if in a world where there are no humans, there's no one to really care about what course nature takes. And so, in that sense, I think nature, fungi, they've been around, they'll be fine no matter what happens to us. But if we want to see a future where we will be around to appreciate it, I think we need to think about how to partner with fungi and the rest of the natural world. And yeah, I think decentering ourselves from the picture is useful insofar as it recognizes that we're not the center of the picture. But I don't think we can be cavalier about just letting nature do what it's going to do, because it might not have our future in mind the way that we do. So I think coming to recognize the fungal dimension of life is part of, in my view, a broader move to just recognize life in general and our part in it. So yeah, I guess to say like, what can we do for the fungi? My answer is to recognize them and respect them. And in so doing, recognize and respect everything to which they connect, which is, as it turns out, the rest of the natural world.
It's like the tree in the forest or the double slit experiment. What happens if we're not around to observe things? It's fashionable to say we are part of nature, but I'm not sure we really are. We're a system, but unlike mushrooms, our conscious minds and individual needs get in the way of the innate subconscious need of our own species system to move towards survival and towards thriving. Another guest who spoke about the interactions between humans and nature is Simon Leadbeater in one of my very favourite episodes, number 79. In the interview, Simon quick steps through anthropomorphism, plant and animal sentience, and sacred groves, and you can tell my mind is blown.
My brain's going whirring round, and I'm thinking just off the top of my head that really the only thing we can all do is maybe take up the Jain religion and
yes, absolutely.
Get back.
Yes.
But
yes.
So actually that leads on to my next question, which is the issue of open access to nature. And you blogged about this recently, and I wondered if you could explain what open access to nature is in your opinion and why that actually may be problematic in view of what you've just spoken about.
I try and do that, and I suppose I better start by saying I'm not suggesting somebody shouldn't have access to nature at all. That would be an absurd thing to say. But my views extend from considering trees sacred and animals feeling in ways similar, not the same, but similar to us. And in my blog, I refer to Bambi, the book, not the film. And I believe its anthropomorphism is appropriate. And I'd also, in answering the question, cast your mind back to when I said the worship of Artemis prevented the human invasion of forests because those forests were sacred to her. Now, I was invited to write a blog by Nearby Wild, and I decided to do so because I think this is a very thorny, misunderstood subject, and I think it's very political. I think some political parties wish to promote what's called a right to roam, which basically means people can, with exceptions, walk wherever they like, presumably accompanied by their dogs. And I feel, in a way, this is part of a toff-bashing agenda, if I can put it like that, and simply hasn't been thought through at all. And actually, without realizing it, it's a human supremacy agenda, which puts human interests above all else. And if we think about it for a moment, even relating it to our gardens, we wouldn't think it okay to walk up to a blackbird nest, for example. If we knew a blackbird were nesting in a particular hedge, we would steer clear. We would give that nest respect because we would know going close would frighten Mummy Blackbird away.
To be honest, going through the back catalogue has proven what an absolute parade of sympathetic, intellectual, philosophical and sensitive people that have appeared on the show, all chipping away to put right the wrongs that have been visited on the planet. Sally Bauer, Benny Hawksby, Anna Zachrison, John Little, Sid Hill, Toby Diggins, Fergus Garrett. The list goes on. And if you haven't already, please take some time to trawl the back catalogue for these past gems. One of the many guests hoping we can get out of our own way as a species and start acting collectively and responsibly is Mary Reynolds, as nominated by listener, gardener and friend of the podcast, Jenny Loudon.
So now I'm asking people to give at least half of any land they have, including the patch that their house sits on, give at least half of it back to nature, because we've taken too much and we have to give as much of it as possible back, and to allow it to rewild, because nature knows best what to plant there. We haven't a clue what we're at. Everything she needs is already in the ground. If we expose the earth and allow it to come through, or just leave it alone, depending on each patch of earth is different. Some of them can be left alone. Some of them might need a little bit of reboot for the ecosystem. But all I'm asking is that people put up a sign in their land saying this is an ark, and put the website underneath to explain to people what's happening. And this is an environmental movement, which is a wild growth movement. It's giving people hope, giving them something that they can do to actually impact the crisis that we're living in. And it's spreading like wildfire all over the earth, and there's arcs everywhere now. I only launched it in March, and the hope is that it's not dependent on me. It's a wild growth movement. It's a very, very simple movement, and I'm hoping that if enough of us do this, and you'll hear a lot of people saying, that won't make any difference, it's only tiny little bits of garden, but actually there's quite a lot of farms coming on board. I'm asking county councils, local governments to come on board. I'm asking schools to come on board, and we're creating a map of arcs now, and if we can connect them all up, it'll make a massive patchwork quilt which will wrap its way around the globe, and it will shift the consciousness and change the level of understanding of connection we have and dependence we have on nature by doing absolutely nothing.
The morning I interviewed Mary, I woke up and I had a really strange pattern on my leg, and it was like a semicircle of four-sided shapes. And as soon as I noticed it, it practically disappeared. And it wasn't like the pattern you get from sleeping on the bottom of your mattress. There was nothing corresponding that I had leant on or been up against that could have caused this pattern. And at the end of the interview, for some reason, I blurted this story out to Mary, and she said, "Oh, do you remember the bit in the book where I had a similar experience?" And she'd also had a pattern appear on her, and it had led to basically, I think, her garden at Chelsea. And I hadn't remembered the story at all, but obviously made the link in my brain somehow. But that was a very strange experience. I thought I'd throw that one out there because sometimes the podcast doesn't make sense and it goes in weird directions. And that's a good example of that. And then, of course, there are the technical issues. And anyone who knows me knows I break anything and everything electrical. It's a standing joke. And as I've said many times before, I can't think of a person less suited to using electronic devices to record and broadcast a podcast. And yet, here we are. Cleve West and Kim Wilkie were on the receiving end of a full memory card. and graciously re-recorded sections of their interviews. More recently, Debbie, Carol and I wrestled with a Zoom meeting with no sound, where we communicated using the power of mime and our lip-reading skills. The list goes on and could fill an episode of its own. But hopefully, it all seems seamless when it goes out to you. So I wanted to talk a bit about podcasts that generate a lot of feedback, and the episodes that spring to mind are those which are quite deep and philosophical, or those which cover relatively uncharted territory. The episode with Kevin Philip Williams and Michael Guidi about taking inspiration from natural shrublands in planting design generated a bit of a buzz. The episode with Hannah Varga about creating art using natural materials and the artistic process itself resonated with listeners. And the recent episode with Ella Malt of Soil and Soul also struck a chord, as do many of the episodes which talk about operating a business in an industry where it can be difficult to run a profitable outfit without compromising your personal beliefs and values. I don't know about you, but I often listen to podcasts whilst gardening. And when I was working on my own sometimes, the voices in my earbuds became like work colleagues, and it's nice to know you're not alone. Another deep and political thinker is guest Jake Rayson, who, along with the episode on vegan fertilisers with Erin Riley, was nominated by Cleve West as a memorable guest. When I interviewed Jake in episode 294, he spoke about wood meadows and how we need to move away from economic models which force the degradation of nature. I asked the question of how we can do this. Are you proposing that these things take place on private land or public land? And are you saying that actually in order to make this happen, we need to take the hit economically, we need to find more people to work the land, we need to find different ways of using it and seeing it as valuable rather than monetary? How does this work going forward?
I don't know is the short answer. But this is the question. But this question, there's a fantastic book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And it's about the relationship between European colonists and the indigenous people and the difference in kind of philosophy and outlook. So the indigenous cultures in North America have been thriving for 10,000 years, and the Europeans go over and have messed everything up in 200-300 years. So something has gone wrong with the way that we approach life, the way that we approach the economy, the way that we grow food, the way that we create stuff. So David Graeber says in the book, this is the time to ask big questions. But it's not just down to one person. I'm a gardener, I'm a designer, I don't know that much. It needs everybody on board, and it needs everyone to ask difficult questions. At the moment, I don't know if you've noticed, there is a general election going on. But what's being offered is more of the same. It's neoliberal, austerity-driven. It's all about money. It's all about the bottom line, rather than using the power that you actually have as a nation, as a group of individuals, as communities, to bring about change, because it can be done.
Jake is a great advocate for both humans and wildlife, whereas I tend to favour the wildlife much more than the annoying humans. Championing wildlife was always a key part of the podcast. And of course, there have been some amazing ecologists, entomologists, and various other ologists and doctorists. To name a few of my favourites that I highly, highly recommend checking out: Jeff Ollerton, Dave Gorson, Terry Woods, Doug Tallamy, Richard Jones, Benjamin Vogt, Ian Bedford, Val Bourne, Paul Sterry, Hugh Warwick, and Kate Risley. I've linked all the episodes and guests mentioned in the show notes, along with the episode numbers, to help you navigate your way through them, should you wish to go back and listen. So back when I started the podcast, I'd been listening to as many gardening-related podcasts as I could get my hands on, and there weren't very many, and there were even less good ones. Another long-time supporter of the show nominated the Ask Me Anything episode, where I was interviewed by listener Joe Richardson, which reminded me why I would never be invited onto Gardener's Question Time, which was one of the podcasts I listened to a lot back in the day.
The last question is from Ronnie, who is a patron and friend of the show. And his question, which I thought was brilliant, was if a plant breeder were to offer to name a cultivar of a plant after you, what would you like it to be and why? And then maybe they might even invite you to Chelsea and you have to sit in front of it and get the press to take loads of pictures of you.
I know. Do you know what? I saw that question and I was like, oh, that is definitely a Gardener's Question Time question. And I honestly racked my brains over this one, and the closest I could come to thinking about a particular plant is because on the podcast and just generally in life, I can be painfully honest. I thought perhaps it should be a type of honesty.
Right.
But I don't
Very
know.
good.
I don't know what it would be called. Probably Sarah's honesty. And that's about as creative as I can get. Sorry, I'm not on Matthew Wilson's level when it comes to plant name puns. Yeah, I don't have the witty one-liners to be on Gardener's Question Time. I guess I don't recommend spraying and killing stuff as a go-to solution for gardening problems either, so I'm definitely never likely to be asked on. I jest, of course. They don't still do that, do they? Another episode from back in the day that still gets referenced today and was nominated by various people, including Andrew and Paula on Facebook, is 178, Feeding Your Soil with Human Manure. Joseph C. Jenkins has produced a handbook on how to compost human waste and use it on your garden, even your food crops, which is a concept that's alien to many.
The whole point of composting is it eliminates the pathogens. That's why when I first started this book, it was a graduate thesis, and I turned it into a book. Because when I found out that the composting process eliminates disease organisms, I thought that was fascinating. Whoever talks about that, what public health people know anything about composting? None. Composting is not a function of public health, and it should be, because the composting organisms destroy human disease organisms. The compost environment is alien to human disease organisms. Take polio virus or something like that. Those pathogens are wanting your body. You put those pathogens in a compost environment, they die. In fact, polio, the virus specifically, will die rapidly in a compost environment. Everything from parasitic worms, microscopic eggs, bacteria, all those things disappear in the compost system. So the idea that you shouldn't use the compost because it's not safe is exactly opposite of what people should be thinking. Because if you do have pathogens being excreted from your body, ideally, we would have a system to eliminate those from the environment, and composting is that system. Otherwise, you just push the lever on the toilet, flush it out somewhere, and it ends up polluting the rivers, lakes, streams, estuaries with bacteria and a lot of other things. The drugs that they excrete, the pharmaceuticals, that kind of thing. And those things are remediated in compost. The whole compost phenomenon is miraculous.
Never let it be said that I don't push the envelope when it comes to finding guests with something groundbreaking to say. Speaking of which, there are 3 guests I'd love to have on the podcast, and despite reaching out and having conversations, for one reason or another it hasn't happened. The first is one I've mentioned before, and that is Indigenous American botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer. The second is ecologist Monica Gagliano, who writes about plant behaviour and cognition, and whose work is fairly mind-blowing. And the third is Professor Patricia Wiltshire, forensic ecologist and author of numerous books, including Traces, which documents the work she does on criminal cases, and will make you both marvel at her and despair at the state of the field in which she works. And I've run out of time to include a clip, but on the topic of the loss of our botanical education, episode 247, Botanical Education with Seb Stroud, was a real eye-opener and highlights the loss of knowledge and the huge amount of effort that would be needed to halt it, let alone begin to rebuild the system. Thank you to Charlotte for nominating that one. So the final episode I'm going to choose is the one episode that made me cry, and that does not happen a lot. It was right at the end of the episode after the guest, Catherine Horwood, stopped speaking, and I cut it out. Listening back to the episode again, it was still moving. It's a lovely interview about a really excellent biography of one of our most legendary gardeners, Beth Chatto. I never met Beth, sadly, but I have spent time at Great Dixter, and also, sadly, I never met Christo, which is, a real regret. But what I get, certainly from Great Dixter, is a real sense of family there, and everything they do, Christo runs through it, as does his influence. And you couldn't do that, I don't think. You couldn't have a legacy that continued beyond you so successfully if you hadn't been so involved with the people who were there and collaborated with them, treated them as family, educated them, instilled your kind of way of gardening. And I feel probably it's the same with
Beth, because her nursery continues, her garden continues, and her legacy continues through the Beth Chatto Education Trust. So can you just talk a little bit about the legacy she has left behind?
Well, it's a different legacy to Dixter in some ways, but it's a marvellous legacy in many of the same ways. A few years ago, I think it's about 8 years ago, Beth was getting older, the business was struggling a bit, and there was no Fergus at Beth's garden. Though he had worked there briefly, but that's another story. So there was no Fergus. But at that time, Beth asked her granddaughter, Julia, if she would come and help out at the garden. Now, Julia isn't a gardener, but she's a very good businesswoman, and she came in and she's really helped regenerate the business, the nursery and the garden, but always, always with Beth's blessing. And it was marvellous that she did that. And in the last 2 years of Beth's life, they came up with the idea of the Beth Chatto Education Trust, because, as I said, Beth always wanted to be a teacher. She was a teacher, a great communicator, and she thought it was so important that the message of growing plants, but of young people particularly, being in touch with nature, learning about plants. And so she set up this charity, which is now thriving, and we're very proud to have some of the really great names as patrons, people like Dan Pearson, Fergus, of course. And this is a whole new strand to the garden, and things are really healthy there. It's very, very exciting for the future. Beth, obviously the garden was key to her, but as you said, her staff also were family to her. And that was always her main concern as well, that the staff, many of whom have been here, despite the fact that she was, strict, but she inspired such loyalty. And most of them have been there throughout their working life. They loved her. And she's still there, as Christo is at Dixter. Beth is, you feel she's just round the corner somewhere.
And to wrap everything up in a neat bow, I'll be taking part in a panel discussion at the Beth Chatto Symposium, which is held in Essex on the 29th and 30th of August. And I've put a link to the website in case you decide to join me there. And if you're already coming along, please come and say hello. Thanks to all of you again for making Roots and All what it is. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.